Hello, everybody. I am Patty Dorito. I am the owner and founder of Holistic Healing Atlanta. At Holistic Healing Atlanta, we don't just treat symptoms, we look for underlying causes where your body may not be functioning so well. It may be physical, such as genetic variants, which cause breakdowns, or lack of movement, exercise, or sleep. We look also, how is the person learning to de-stress themselves? We also look at the emotional stuff. Is it trauma? I use a modality called quantum neuro reset therapy, or QNRT. It could be spiritual, and we address that as the client wishes. And I just know when I address the body, the mind, and the soul, I feel better and I function better. So tonight we're going to talk about addictions. And people often see addiction as a moral failing on the part of the person struggling. Tonight, we're going to look at underneath of that addiction and see some underlying causes, especially trauma. So I'm going to give you a few statistics that are pretty amazing. That 75% of men and women in substance abuse treatment centers report histories of abuse and trauma. 97% of homeless women with mental illness report severe or sexual abuse, severe physical or sexual abuse. And 12 to 34% of individuals in substance abuse treatment centers say they have PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder. In a survey among adolescents receiving treatment for substances, more than 70% of the patients had a history of trauma. So what is trauma exactly? So here's a definition. Trauma is the response to a deeply distressing or disturbing event that overwhelms an individual's ability to cope, causes feelings of helplessness, diminishes their sense of self and their ability to feel a full range of emotions and experiences. So the CDC, along with Kaiser Permanente, did a study called the Adverse Child Experiences, or ACE study. And it was from 1995 to 1997 to investigate what the effects of childhood abuse was on later in life health and well-being. So the ACE study defines abuse in a number of ways. So the first one's physical abuse. It's the intentional use of physical force that results in physical injury. Examples include hitting, kicking, shaking, burning, or other shows of force against a child, or actually if the child sees physical abuse, maybe their parents fighting and pushing and hitting. There's sexual abuse, which involves pressuring or forcing a child to engage in sexual acts. It includes things like fondling, penetration, and exposing a child to sexual activities. Emotional abuse refers to behaviors that harm a child's self-worth and emotional well-being. Examples include name-calling, shaming, rejection, withholding love, threatening, belittling, and teasing. And lastly, neglect. And that's the failure to meet a child's basic needs, physical and emotional. Includes housing, food, clothing, education, and access to medical care. So the effects are stunning. It includes depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress, suicide, unintended pregnancies, fetal death, infectious diseases, chronic diseases such as cancer and diabetes, risky behaviors, drugs, alcohol, unsafe sex, less education, less income. So tonight I have a very special guest, Caitlin Byrne, who works at an addiction residential treatment center called MAR, or Metro Atlanta Recovery Residences. Is here in Atlanta, obviously. Caitlin is an LAPC who works with men and women struggling with substance abuse. She also runs a private practice called Living Hope Counseling, where she focuses on healing through a biopsychosocial model, personal wellness, and internal family systems. Caitlin was born and raised in Atlanta She loves the Braves, and she is hoping to be in the stadium this summer. So please welcome Caitlin. Hi, Caitlin.
Oh, hey, Patty.
It's good.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for coming. So, Caitlin, what do you think? How do you see trauma? You work with addiction every day.
Mhm.
So how do you see it?
Yeah. So listening to your definitions and even the types of traumas that you were discussing, that it encompasses all of that. But there's basically no one who comes into treatment who I don't consider that they have some kind of trauma, whether it's a big T trauma, like living through a physical disaster, going to war, or some of us might even say this past year of our lives has been, pretty traumatic, loss, death, or a little T trauma, which that's more what people who come into treatment don't realize that they've experienced. The neglect, the emotional needs not getting met, those little tiny, I like to consider them those little tiny cracks where the lies started forming, and the negative experiences started pouring out of. And those just building on top of each other, on top of each other, on top of each other, until you have to find some kind of solution, which my clients all find that in, alcohol and drugs. So everything that you were saying in those definitions regarding trauma, that's exactly what I'm looking for as well. Those experiences that really harm our inner self, impact all the parts of us. But maybe we didn't really know how to take care of them at that time. We didn't necessarily ask for them to occur to us. A lot of traumas are things that happen to us originally. And then, we may have a lot of complex trauma on top of that by putting ourselves into situations that, are reactive out of our initial traumas.
So how would you describe complex trauma, Caitlin?
Yeah, complex trauma just being, or compound trauma, or just being, the initial event occurred, the initial traumatic event, but then you just kind of keep putting yourselves into situations where, that these kinds of things keep occurring, right? And before you're able to address the first trauma, you already have another one. I would also kind of see, grief sometimes as a complex trauma, right? You have the initial loss, and then if you're unable to address that grief right away and another loss comes along, or a traumatic event, or just something where you were already in those unpleasant emotions, right? And struggling with how to deal with those. It can happen that more starts coming. We live in a very active world that there's constantly things going on. I think this whole last year, we have a pandemic on top of racial tension, on top of a lot of loss, on top of fear, on top of a political season. That can be a lot of complex trauma for some people.
Yeah, I was thinking while you were talking too about, say a woman gets raped, and then so that's capital T trauma, but then she goes and tells, say, her mother, and her mother doesn't believe her, or whoever, or they say, well, you deserved it, you were drinking, or whatever. Also, that secondary trauma can be worse than at least in my experience working with trauma, women who have had sexual trauma. Often, yeah,
that more the not being heard or accepted or believed hurts even not more, but impacts just as much as the initial trauma itself. Yeah,
right. Because too, with all the trauma, they're telling themselves lies about themselves. They start believing these lies. They get kind of, you were talking about cracks, and they start believing some of these things.
Which distorts their reality, right? And their ability to get help with those things.
Yeah. So what do you think of the ACEs study?
Yeah. So I think the ACE study is super helpful. But actually we don't use it in its formality in our treatment center. But I think it's because all of those questions get answered very naturally. And almost coming in expecting they're going to have, the score is only 0 to 10, right? You either have had the experiences that they're asking about or not. But because it's a residential treatment center where I'm at, we have 90 days for them. We do a lot of initial assessments to really get their story and understand where they came from, their family of origin, doing genogram sessions with them, doing a psycho assessment. We use a lot of different tools besides just the ACE study to be able to gather their story. And I think a little bit more of a therapeutic way through relationship, through conversation, instead of just, has this happened to you? Has this happened to you? Has this happened to you? So I do think it's really helpful as a foundation to kind of understand how a child is impacted by these things, experiencing multiple of these events before they're even 18 years old, in their most heightened developmental stages, right, of having all these experiences. A really good foundation of of where they're kind of starting out when they come into treatment.
Yeah. So when somebody comes in for treatment, how frequently do you see that it is related to trauma, as you start developing that rapport and finding all that information out?
Yeah. Well, there's kind of a couple ways to look at that, right? So as a clinical team, we are looking for those cracks. We're trying to determine, because by the time they have come into a long-term residential treatment, the drinking or their drug of choice has become the solution to a problem. It is their problem, as in it's causing them lots of consequences relationally, emotionally, financially, legally, probably, but it's really at the point where it was a solution to an earlier problem. And we like to look at that solution in the lens of trauma. Where did that crack begin, and how did the lies form? And maybe it's really obvious traumas for some, having sexual traumas, or, loss at an early age, or bullying, even neglect, family of origin issues, divorce, accidents, all sorts of things. So I would say there's always trauma. I wouldn't say that it's necessarily a traumatic event that occurs that gets them into treatment. That wouldn't be necessarily the, as we call it, the crisis that got them here. That could just have been a legal issue, DUI, a wife or a husband finally holding the boundary of, we're not doing this anymore, right? But as we get to know their stories and learn about them, and go through that, there's almost always a traumatic experience, because they've started to use the drug of choice to numb themselves, to stuff their experiences, to cover up something that's painful, right? So we want to get into that pain and determine what it is to start beginning to heal that. Because if that's not looked at and healed, which is usually a trauma, if that's not looked at, paid attention to, healed, they're going to go right back out and drink or use their drug of choice, because there's just too much pain.
What motivates a person to actually come into treatment? I mean, that's pretty drastic, to give up 90 days of your life.
Yeah. Several things. Family members holding boundaries, being done supporting the addiction part of it, right? Maybe you've tried and tried and tried, and finally you're like, this is all I've got. You go to treatment, or you're kicked out of the house, or I'm going to have to separate from you if it's a married couple. A lot of times it's a DUI. By the time they come to us, which is, for a longer period of time, everyone wants to try the 30 or 40 day, ones. We're a 90-day treatment. That is a long time to give up. But by the time they're with us, they've had some pretty serious consequences, usually lost a job, multiple DUIs. We are not a court mandated, because we are private. But, a judge could say, it'd be really good for you to go to treatment. And a lawyer will be like, yeah, go to treatment. It'll lessen your sentence, kind of a thing. And then they can choose more. So we do have some guys with legal issues. We also work with a lot of professionals who their licenses are on the line, so they come into treatment in order to maintain their license. So we have a great professionals program for them as well. So there's a lot of things. Some people, it's rare, But some people will come in because they just got like tired and they were sick, like they just were sick and tired of living life, waking up, having to drink in the morning or use their drug right away. They've run out of money. Yeah, there's a lot of reasons people check themselves into treatment. Medical issues for sure, like their liver, they're in cirrhosis or have pretty serious pancreatitis or something like that. Lots of issues.
So, and again, there's something just kind of popped into my head. How important is the family system, the family support? I mean, because sometimes that is the problem, the family. But how does MAR include them, or how do you see them?
Yeah, critical. That's my main role at MAR, is to work with the families while their client, our client, their loved one, while their loved one is in treatment. My role is to start working with the system, right? So, from a family systems model, we don't see our clients just as this individual person. They are a part of a greater system. They are a part of a family of origin. And so our client does get to decide, who's going to be a part of that. They sign releases so we can engage with their family members, whether that's their wife or their children or their parents, or, sometimes aunts and uncles, just kind of depending on the dynamics in the system. But we believe it's critical. You talked in the beginning that a lot of people believe that this is a moral disease or a moral choice. And at MAR, we run off that it is a disease model. It is a chronic disease that, if not cared for, like a cancer, will continue to spread and progress and become have higher and greater consequences. And so we do believe that it is a family disease, not that everybody in your family is using, but that because you love someone who is struggling with this disease, you've been impacted, emotionally, physically, financially, relationally. So we at MAR definitely believe that it is necessary for the family to enter into recovery as well, and to start walking through, how this has impacted them. What are their emotions around all of this? Have they fallen into things like enabling and codependency, rescuing, controlling, had a lack of boundaries? All these things, learning this stuff as a family can help support the loved one in recovery moving forward. So we believe it's a critical piece, and at MAR, that it's absolutely necessary for the family to be involved.
So does the family member feel like, why do I have to come? Because it's really that person's problem?
Kind of. So I think a lot of people end up choosing MAR as the place for their loved one to go because they know there is the family side of it as a support. So a lot of them are a lot more open. Now, when I start explaining to them what it is, the work that we'll do together, they're a little hesitant and resistant. And it's pretty, for me, I just kind of say, you don't want your loved one to be resistant for 90 days. So lean in a little, try something, take a risk, lean into this emotional discomfort a little bit. That's what we're asking your loved one to do. So to kind of encourage them to look at their piece in this too. But there's definitely family members who, will say, I don't want to be involved. Or there are clients who come in who don't have family that they want to be a part of it because they may not be safe. It may not be a family system that functions well together, is willing to support, is willing to engage in the process. So we have to do a little bit of kind of understanding the system before we just fully engage as well, to make sure that they are supportive of recovery, that they, are willing to partake in their own kind of growing and learning experience as well. Because you're right, some family members are not safe. They might be the perpetuator of the abuse. They might be using themselves and unsafe because of their own disease of addiction. So we do have to kind of consider the emotional safety that even they, if they're harping on and preaching, that it's all their own fault and all this kind of stuff, it's just not always helpful to treatment. So yeah, we do a little work to make sure they're safe people as well.
Yeah. So I know you talked a little bit, but how do you assess for the trauma? I mean, I know you don't just go through a checklist, because that's pretty impersonal.
Yeah.
But
yeah.
How do you do that?
Yeah. So when they come in, they do fill out, I'm totally blanking on what the assessment is called now. Wow. But they do come in, they do a whole psychosocial assessment, which is a lot of questions, but it's presented more in, they fill it in, they answer all the questions, but then they explore it with their primary counselor a lot more in just like a conversational based and kind of starting to learn them as a person and understand them. So they will do that with their primary counselor. And as a treatment team, you know, the primary counselor will share with the team what's relevant for everyone to know. I also do a genogram session with them, which focuses on the family of origin roles and generationally as well.
So what is a genogram?
Oh, well, it's kind of like building a family tree. That's how I explain it to our clients. We build a family tree. We look at 3 generations. We talk about patterns and roles and relationships and dynamics and, you know, feelings towards the different family members, as well as, you know, what did they learn about love? What did they learn about discipline? What did they learn about addiction growing up, if that was even? What did they learn about emotions in their family of origin? We talk a lot about attachment, because a lot of our little T traumas can come out of our attachment, which we talked about the last time I was on here. So yeah, then we do a genogram. And then the big thing too that we do with our clients is they all have to present their life story. And just kind of going through their life story, they kind of hit on those big moments where they recognized a crack in their story, or a pivot, or a turning point, or a traumatic event.
How long does it take for the men and women to actually get honest with themselves? I mean, like,
yeah,
it takes a minute.
It varies. I wouldn't even say probably, I mean, honesty and integrity are 2 big things that we work on while they're with us, as well as reconnecting to their feelings and to their emotions. You know, and I would say that it takes even more, well past 90 days to continue to be honest. We have to recognize that a lot of what they're being given in treatment is a brand new language. You know, they haven't even known to call something a trauma. They haven't even known to be able to identify it as a pain point, as something that was not okay, that happened to them, or as a result of something. So they're learning a whole new language that they first have to accept before they're willing to continue to be honest moving forward. So we definitely get glimpses of it. Some are more ready than others, but it definitely varies. And they'll have moments of honesty throughout all of treatment. But, you know, I almost say to all of our clients, they deserve therapy for the rest of their lives. They deserve it, to be able to continue to do the hard work that they invested in for 90 days.
Yeah, I think getting a hold of your feelings, you know, being able to identify, besides anger or pissed off or whatever word you want to do. I call them F words, feelings, because they're so hard, because there is a disconnect, or they've been taught it's, you know, don't have feelings, or they've been around someone where they've told them and it got thrown back at them. You know,
Yeah, or they just were never taught emotions, or emotions weren't okay. Exactly like you're saying, they were angry, or, you know, you witnessed a parent who was overly emotive. And so you're like, well, I don't want to do that, you know? And so and I work primarily with the men, right? So they're even taught, like, don't be sensitive, don't be vulnerable, don't, you know, so even breaking down those messages takes some time. But I mean, every group that they're in, they're asked, what are you feeling? What is that feeling? And I love too, you know, the field of therapy is just constantly, we're learning new things about human beings, that it's just so fascinating. And so I love all the work that's being done to really understand how our body is telling us, you know, what it is before we even have the word of a feeling, right? We can say, it's something here in my gut, or it's something in, like, I'm having a pain in my arm, or, you know, or a sensation in my throat, or these kinds of things that we don't necessarily immediately attach to our therapeutic need or our feelings, but like, yeah, but really paying attention to what our body is telling us as well. Our feelings don't just live here. They're not just in our mind.
Yeah, that's cool. When I worked with addiction, and then when I've done groups around addiction, and they have to go around and say what they're feeling.
Mhm.
Like,
Yeah.
good isn't a feeling.
Right.
Feel like,
Right.
I'm like, mm-mm.
We give them cheat sheets. They get feeling words. They get feeling wheels, and
I love it.
they can cheat off that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, Caitlin, do your clients even recognize they've been traumatized? Because I find that a lot of times they're like, well, that's just, I mean, they're swimming in water and they don't even recognize they're in water because they're swimming in it. But go ahead.
By the time they get to us, their drug of choice is their survival. So they've become desensitized to the ways they might put themselves into dangerous situations or traumatize themselves in order to get their drug of choice, right? So some people do put themselves in really dangerous situations to go and get their drugs. I mean, nowadays though, unfortunately, it's not difficult to get your hands around the drugs that you would want. Or they get behind the wheel of a car, or they yell at someone, or get thrown out of a house. But it is a survival. They're in survival mode by the time they've gotten, their disease has progressed enough to get to where they are with us. And put it this way: if you walked into our treatment center and you sat in group, you could just as easily think you were in a men's Bible study. Like, they're not the picture that I think some people have of like, oh, you must have been living under a bridge or in a car before you got here. That's not the population necessarily that is at every treatment center, right? So when you start diving into their family of origin things, they want to be like, had a perfect childhood, my childhood was perfect. And as we start kind of talking through, what might have been hard in childhood, what was, oh, your parents got divorced. Oh, you lost a sibling. Oh, like you lived in it. Your father was an alcoholic, or your mother was an alcoholic, or, oh, there was this period of time where your dad just left the family for a little bit of time. Like, the ideal of like this perfect family, like, we don't want to get into this stuff. We slowly and gently kind of take that down a little bit. Not to dishonor, but really in the chance to be able to work on that honesty, right? Like, I shared this with all of my clients, like, being honest is actually a very honoring thing to your parents. They know they're not perfect. It's impossible to be a perfect parent. They did not know who you would be uniquely as a person. There's no way they would have met all your needs. So let's just be honest. And then you, as an adult now, can take responsibility for the things. We don't talk about these things so you can play victim or poor me or any of these things. We bring them to light so that we can recognize the responsibility we need to take now as adults to correct those things where we were misled. One of the big things too is they'll talk a lot about relationships, and like, a lot of the guys have gotten cheated on. And I would say that's traumatic. You were in a loving relationship with a person and they stepped out on that. Like, that's a trauma, a lot of guys are surprised, but like, they've never grieved the fact that they had an abortion. And they just, even when they're in treatment, they can think like, oh, I thought that was just for the woman, but really that impacted me greatly. And they get a chance to grieve that and hear from other guys, I had to do that too. Me too. I didn't realize that, like, I needed to grieve that as well. Like things like that. So yeah, I would say they don't come in recognizing they have a problem or like have been traumatized or that their feelings are stuffed or numbed. They're usually like, just teach me how to not drink and I'm going to be okay. And, when we get into the weeds and really dig in and be like, we don't want to just get you to stop drinking. We want you to thrive. Like, we want you to live a full life, and getting into this healing is a big part of that. So we dig deep. We dig real deep.
Awesome. So why do you think a person goes to substances, alcohol or drugs, to soothe themselves of the trauma rather than dealing with it in a more healthy way? Like, goes this way, it goes that way.
Yeah. I think the easiest answer to that is probably that it's faster. It's real quick to just drink a bottle of wine or multiple than it is to, and cheaper than just going into therapy week after week. And digging into, the past things. It's a lot easier to numb than it is to look at things. The consequences come later. At first you're feeling good, like, oh, I found the thing that makes me finally feel normal, or something like that. I think a lot of other things take time to work through, the traumas. The healthier ways take a little bit more time. Even before we got on here, we were talking about, natural remedies and stuff, and you've got to give your body time to even adjust to those things, whereas, alcohol or drug can work in an instant. Drugs specifically can work pretty quickly. So, and then I think once that just becomes your one solution, your one coping skill, like, then that's what you've got, and it turns into survival. When that becomes your only coping skill that you've maintained, as opposed to maybe going for a run or going out to eat with a friend, or even going to therapy. I would say the easiest is that substances are just quicker.
I was, because I work with genetics and things, like 40 to 60% they feel is like a genetic kind of thing. And then the rest is what we call epigenetic, which is environmental, like the trauma and things like that. So there is a propensity towards it genetically, but just because you have the genetic propensity doesn't mean that you're going to become an addict or an alcoholic. But
I mean, we definitely discussed the generationals of, if your grandfather had it, if your dad had it, if your grandmother, if your grandma, we talk through the generational piece of it as well, to just kind of understand, even the family's understanding of it. If they've been dealing with it, has the family gotten to Al-Anon? Did you talk about this? Like, hey, this is in your genes, like this is gonna, this could perpetuate into your generation. You need to be careful. But even sometimes having those conversations, they're still going to end up where they end up because of that, the nature part of it as well too. We definitely talk about it. I wouldn't say that we, at our treatment center, I don't think we really harp on the genetic part of it too much. We can recognize and acknowledge it, and that it's there, but I don't think we stay there too long.
So like when I do a genogram with my clients as well, we do a genogram looking at the family history, and I look at the addictions and the alcohol, not just in a genetic sense, but also because what were you taught about alcohol or drugs?
What was modeled to you? Absolutely.
Yeah. And did mom come home from work every day and start drinking to soothe herself? So it was like, oh, I guess this is a good way to soothe myself. Yeah.
Yep. Yeah. Same. Yeah. We look at all that as well.
Okay. So Caitlin, what do you recommend to people if they or their child have been traumatized so that they don't end up with these fractures and cracks and using, because everybody in this past year experienced quite a few little traumas or big traumas. So do you have any suggestions?
Yeah, I think first of all, is creating a time and a space where it's okay for your family to talk about these things, right? Like if you have a propensity to stuff or to avoid or to shove something under the rug, I would encourage you to just create a time and a space where you invite these conversations into your family, around your table, sitting on your couches, as you're tucking your kids into bed, whatever's most appropriate for your family. And the conversation may not happen, but your kids need to know that it is okay to talk about these things, that it's okay to talk about, hey, something really hard happened to me today. They may not have the language of trauma, right? But like, if they're scared to come home and worried that they won't be believed, or they might be a burden, or this is uncomfortable, how do you start creating spaces where unpleasantry is accepted and comfortable to come around and talk about. A lot of the family work that I do is even with my clients in my private practice with their families, is just starting to help them, get uncomfortable in their conversations, so that they start building safety. They start building like an acceptance of, oh, I'm at least going to be listened to. Parents, I encourage you just to listen. You don't have to have the answer. You don't have to have a great speech prepared. You don't have to fix it. Listen to your kids, but they need to know that there's a space that's okay to do as well. Modeling what feelings are. I understand that we think it's better to have conversations behind closed doors, but really, so many of the clients that I work with who are younger in their 20s, they're learning from everything. They're learning from YouTube, they're learning from social media, they're learning from teachers, from peers, from parents. So model what it is, the intelligence that you want them to have, the emotional intelligence you want them to have. So many of them are like, my parents thought everything was appropriate to have behind closed doors, which just taught me feelings aren't okay in our house. Conversation's not okay in our house. Let me not be a burden. Let me kind of detach from these emotions, because there's not a space for them here. So I just encourage families, if you're very aware of a trauma and it's coming out sideways everywhere, get to therapy. I mean, really, like, don't hesitate, please. There's a lot of great therapists out there. If you have addiction in your family, talk about it, normalize that. Like, this is a part of things. Begin to have a language. There's lots of really good resources out there for like every age of your child to kind of start understanding this dragon, this disease, this part of your family system. But really, I just encourage, like, start having emotional conversations with your kids.
Yeah,
talk about emotions.
Yeah, it's a little bit hard with these things.
Yeah. And that's what I mean, creating the space where that's not allowed, right? They can't text their friend while they're in it. Or even if it's just 30 minutes, put a basket, And again, I want you to know it is going to be unnatural at first. Any shift that you're making in the homeostasis of your family system, like any shift is going to be uncomfortable at first, but it builds into becoming more natural. It takes time, but your family's worth investing in that way, to start to grow together in that way. So you all know there's a place to come and talk about these things.
So I had another question that popped in my mind. So what happens if you find your 16-year-old is drinking or using drugs? What do you recommend to parents? Because I know they want to control and manage everybody. Like, what do you say? Because that's awful for the parent to discover that.
Yeah, absolutely, it is awful. It's starting to recognize and look at your boundaries, right? What kind of boundaries do you have? What kind of rules maybe do you need to be reset? You may have boundaries around what is allowed in your home, and what are you willing to follow through with if you do catch that again, catch them with drugs again. If you're financially supporting them, how did they get that, the money to be able to, putting your boundaries around your finances, around, the rules in your household. So, and communicating those, like being very, very clear with your child that you found with those boundaries. Making sure you communicate them, and not threatening, but following through with, the next time that I find you with drugs, what are you willing to do? What are you going to follow through with? Like taking the door off the hinges, whatever it is, taking their phone away, the reality is like, you can only control it yourself. Even as a 16-year-old, they're starting to, claim their independence a lot sooner now, because they have such access to the world, right? So there's so much going on outside of your home, in your home, because of those devices, right? So just, I would encourage families to start considering their boundaries and communicating those, of what they're willing to accept and what they're going to follow through with, if they keep finding their loved one with drugs. I would definitely steer you away from being the cool parent who thinks, oh, it's okay if you do this in my house. It's not helpful.
Yeah, yeah. So, Caitlin, thank you. I was wondering if you have any kind of final thoughts, about trauma and addiction.
Yeah. I think that these two things go really hand in hand. I would encourage you right now, if you're a family member who's listening to this and you have a loved one who is active in their addiction, don't try to be their therapist in this moment of trying to dig deep and be a detective to try to find their trauma. I have a lot of families who have really good well wishes to think, oh, it must have been our divorce. Oh, it must have been when we moved. Oh, it must have been their stepdad or their stepmom. And they want so badly to discover the problem themselves, where really it's such an important, dignifying, autonomous experience for your loved one to get to unravel that themselves, to name it themselves, to get to come to terms with it, acceptance, and begin the healing process themselves. So yeah, I would definitely encourage like any family member who's listening to this who has a loved one who's in active addiction, don't try to search out their traumas. If you are someone who's currently struggling with substance abuse, whether you think you have an addiction or not, just consider what it is that you're numbing, what it is that you're stuffing or trying to avoid. I guarantee you there's some pain and some trauma underneath your overuse if you're considering that you have some kind of substance abuse. And yeah, if you're not sure, you can go to marinc.org and we do all free assessments. Our admissions team is amazing, and they'll do a free assessment with you to determine, are you appropriate for inpatient treatment, outpatient treatment, just one-on-one therapy, and what would be best for you. So that's for family members or for individuals who think that, they might have a substance abuse problem.
Well, thank you so much, Caitlin. It's been very informative. You're always a great guest to have on. So it's awesome.
I love to. I mean, this is my heart. This is what I've been working in for a long time. And if anything, to just break the stigma of what addiction is considered. Like it's the people are human beings. They have a lot of dignity, and they have a disease that is progressive and chronic and ravages their personality, right? So, but we gotta,
and they hate it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a burden, but it's survival, and so, so yeah, I just get the help you need, get to AA, get to Al-Anon, get to a 12-step group. There's so much out there. It's vulnerable and it's risky to expose yourself in that way, but
I love what you said. Don't be their therapist and don't try to figure it out. And, and that's hard. That's really hard because so clearly you can see the problem, right?
Yeah. Your loved one in active addiction, they need someone in recovery to walk this journey with them. They need someone who has walked before them and seen, and see the miracles and the promises on the other side. And if you're a family member who has not, it's okay that you're not going to be able to understand it. It's okay. But make sure to get them the help they do need.
So, well, thank you, Caitlin. And I just want to finish up here and just, addictions are very multifaceted, and as complicated as they are, there's not one solution for recovery. But if you know somebody struggling with addiction of any kind, and they're looking for sobriety, there is hope. And you have people like Caitlin that work at MAR and her own private practice. I work with addiction, and I see it a little bit differently in a holistic way, because I look at the brain function, I look at genetics, I look at trauma. So anyway, we're here to help you. And if you're struggling with addiction or anxiety or depression, life transitions, either one of us can help. I use quantum neuro reset therapy, neurofeedback, and holistic methylation. So it's not next Tuesday. So Tuesday, April 13th at 3 p.m. And don't worry if you miss it, because you can view it on my Facebook or my YouTube channel. I have Father Michael Bremer, and we're going to talk about trauma and how it affects the spiritual life. So thanks for listening in, and have a good evening. Bye now.